If we're thinking about our operations and budgeting and control, one of the first things we need to consider is that in order to control something, we have to first measure it. Obviously, you don't know if you're losing product or not making enough sales, or whatever your particular issues might be, if you haven't first measured. And there are a number of things that we may want to be measuring. I've uploaded a number of resources, spreadsheets, and other things in this week's module. But we want to be familiar with this concept of what we can think of as prime costs. And the prime costs in a restaurant or any food operation are going to be the food and beverage costs and your labor costs. Now, there are plenty of other costs. There's utilities, there's rent, there's insurance, there's cleaning products, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we go through a lot of those in the food and beverage cost control class. But your two big categories of expense are food and labor, and those taken together should not add up to more than 65% of your sales. If they do, you're likely to be in trouble. Not in trouble with the law, but just in trouble financially. You might not have enough money to make it through. The typical breakdown on that for most restaurants is going to be about 30% food costs, 35% labor. Now, this varies depending on the kind of place that we're talking about. So, for instance, it's a general rule of thumb. If your food cost goes up, your labor cost should go down. And the reason for that is if your food cost is going up, it's likely, certainly prices could just be increasing, at which point that means you're going to have to adjust your menu prices overall and probably raise them. But what it can also mean is that you may be using a lot of pre-prepared products, what they might call value-added products. So that could be things like, instead of doing butchery in-house, you're getting pre-cut steaks or pre-cut seafood. It may be you're running a sandwich shop, and instead of making soups in-house, you're buying soups from a distributor. Maybe you don't produce your own desserts, but you bring in cakes from someplace outside. Those products are going to cost more than raw materials, just like when you go to the grocery store. If you're buying the ingredients for lasagna and you make your own lasagna, it's going to cost you less than if you buy a pre-prepared frozen lasagna. At least we hope that's the case. If you're buying more what we can think of as convenience products, those prices are going to be higher. Now, obviously, that means that you're not paying somebody to produce those items or to do that butchery, so then your labor cost should be lower. If both your labor cost and your food cost are creeping up, there could be a few issues. One, like I've already said, is that food prices may just be rising, and that's our fact of life. Food prices are always going up. They're not going to be going down. It's true that supermarkets may run something called loss leaders, so they might feature in their weekly sales ad some really good deal on generally a fairly expensive item. Maybe it's New York steaks, or maybe it's frozen shrimp or lobster tails or something like that at a very good price to get people in the door, because they know that you're not just going to buy the one thing. You're going to do all your weekly shopping, and those other prices are higher. So, I'm not talking about sales or specials on certain items. Food prices all across the board are going to continue to rise. Certainly we're feeling the effects of the drought here in California in various years. You can track prices related to that. And then your labor costs may be going up depending on how long your place has been in operation and how long your people have been with you. So when you first open up, you might have a staff of cooks that are making not that much per hour. But if they've stuck with you for a few years and they've had raise after raise, they might be making a significant wage. So mature restaurants often find themselves in this quandary of having, rising food prices, kind of top of the line payroll, and not much wiggle room in terms of where they can go on raising their menu prices. So to measure some of these things, it helps to, number one, have a schedule. This seems obvious, although there is at least one restaurant that I know of, Café du Monde in New Orleans, that supposedly does not have a schedule for the front of the house staff. People just kind of come and go whenever they please. It's open 24 hours a day. I've heard this from somebody who used to work there, but it was a number of years ago, so I don't know if that's really the case or if it's, I find it hard to believe. But at any rate, you're making your schedule, and you're going to want to keep track of the number of guests that you're expecting or that you've had historically. So obviously it's easier to do that once you're in business. When you're talking about projecting or forecasting, you're kind of making these numbers up, and we can think of this as a best guess scenario. But if you have historical data, then you should be able to tell roughly how many people you're expecting to have come through your doors. And you will have a formula for how many staff you need to successfully serve those people. And that's going to vary depending on your style of service, your complexity of your menu, things like that. So, a sandwich shop might get by with just a couple of employees, maybe one person manning the register and one person making the sandwiches. In slow times, maybe that's even just one person. Maybe one person is making sandwiches and ringing things up, right? Hopefully you're busier than that, but that could be the case. On the other end of the spectrum, a very high-end haute cuisine restaurant may have 100+ people on staff. They might have a staff ratio to customer approaching 1-to-1. Now, certainly the prices are going to reflect that. For most of us, we're going to fall somewhere in between. And so kind of my rule of thumb is thinking that a server can handle about 25 to 30 people a night optimally. And by night, I'm talking about spread out over a 4-hour period, let's say from 5 until 9. Now, people can maybe successfully handle more than that. And we might not think about it in that 4-hour period. We might think about that in a 2-hour period, okay, or two-hour periods. So you can handle 25 people in the first 2 hours, 25 people in the last 2 hours. That's debatable. Again, this really depends on your style of service and what the expectations are of your market and your customers. Then in terms of how many cooks it's going to take you to pull off your menu, again, this depends on the complexity of your menu. If you're talking about something with very elaborate presentations and a lot of garnishes per plate, you're obviously going to need more people to pull that menu off than if we're talking about, a more modest style of presentation. You will see that very many well-known chefs have more casual eateries, and it's no surprise that those casual eateries are probably the ones that are making the money and floating the expenses of the larger flagship restaurant. The trend all over is for smaller places, fewer staff, but really excellent food. So particularly here in California, we've removed a lot of the stuffiness from fine dining. We're not expected to wear jacket and tie any place anymore that I can think of, although maybe at the French Laundry they've instituted that. We're very casual here, but that doesn't mean that we don't take our food and beverages quite seriously. We do. And so the trend is we are increasingly casual in terms of the decor, in terms of the style of service perhaps, but increasingly critical of the food. So, we might not need perhaps as many servers, but maybe we need more cooks. Again, you're going to have to come up with your own formula for how to staff your place. But once you've got that formula, there are a number of tools to help you figure out how many people you're going to need. And so one of the ways to do that is just to take how many days you're open, how many people you're expecting to do on each of those days, and then slotting in your servers and your cooks accordingly. So in other words, let's say you're open 7 days a week for dinner only. We'll make it a little easier. And let's say that you have determined that on the weekends, maybe you're serving 150 people on Friday and Saturday. And again, just to make it easy, let's call it 50 people a night for all the rest of the week, for Sunday through Thursday. So that's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 5 days at 50. So that's 250 people plus 2 days at 150. That's 300 people. So a total of 550 people for the week. Now, if we were to take our formula of a server being able to handle, say, 25 people, if we take 550, we divide that by 25, that means we need supposedly 22 servers. Now, that doesn't mean we need 22 people. That means we have 22 shifts that we need to cover. Now, if we divide 22 by 7, number of days in the week, we get 3.14. Well, the reality is we don't need 3 people or more than 3 people on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, because we're expecting to do 50 people. We need 2 servers. On the weekends, when we're talking about 150 people, did I say 150? If I didn't in the beginning, let's just call it 150. That means we need 150 divided by 25, which is going to be 150 divided by 25 is 6. We might need 6 servers on that evening. Or depending on how we feel they're going to come in, maybe we need 4 if most of the people are coming in within a certain time crunch, which is usually the case. Very often, the night might be slow from when you first open until we get into the middle of the dinner hour. Then all hell breaks loose and it gets crazy for a couple of hours, and then it dies back down at the end of the night. So you may think about how many shifts you have to cover, and then you might take a look at how many people you have, right? So if you have 22 shifts to cover and you only have 3 people on staff, obviously you don't have enough. People can't work 7 days a week, and even if they could, that's still not enough people, right? And very often with servers, they have part-time jobs. They might work a couple of days at one restaurant and a couple of days at another. Or they may max out just at 3 and they don't want to work any more than that. It's a very flexible kind of job situation. Cooks, on the other hand, tend to be full-time, although many do have 2 jobs, maybe one in the morning, one in the evening, because that's one of the ways we can all make ends meet in this economy. But generally, cooks tend to be more full-time. The cook schedules tend to be more stable. They're a lot less prone to shifting things around than waiters are, and a lot less prone to want special time off. In terms of measuring your food and beverage, the way to do that is by taking inventory. By taking inventory, I mean physically counting everything, which involves breaking out the scale and weighing things, which involves costing out your recipes. So, at a predetermined time every period. Now, you can decide to do this once a month, once a week, once a year, whatever. a friend of mine who has a place in Mendocino, he said that his accountant has now told him to not even really bother with doing the inventory because for so many years the cost of goods against the amount of sales has been exactly where it should be. So if there's no problems, why waste the time doing it? And I can see the validity in that approach. But to do inventory, what you do is you count everything that you have on the shelf. So let's just make it easy and think that we've only got one item on the shelf. We've got canned tomatoes for making tomato sauce. We count those up and we have 3 cases. To determine how much we've used, we have to do a beginning and an inventory, a beginning and ending inventory. So our beginning inventory was 3 cases. And let's say we're taking inventory once a week. And in that week, we buy 2 more cases of product that goes onto our shelf. And then we count it again at the end of the period, at the end of the week. And let's say we have 4 cases on the shelf. So that means we started with 3, we added 2. So we had 5 available. We wound up with 4. So that means over the course of that week, we used 1 case of tomatoes. Now, if let's say we started out with 3 cases of tomatoes, we bought 2 over the course of the week, and what we wound up with was 1, that would mean we started with 3, we added 2, we wound up with 1, so we used 4 cases during that period. From there, we can figure out what our actual food cost is, because if we just took our invoices, we would see, oh, well, we bought 2 cases of tomatoes, so that's what we're going to use as our dollar figure to calculate our food costs. But that would not be correct because, yes, we bought 2 cases, but we actually used 4 cases. So to produce the food for the amount of sales that we did in that week, we had to use 4 cases of those canned tomatoes. Now, hopefully that makes sense. There's a running inventory worksheet in this week's module that might help you see that a little bit more clearly. But that's just one item, one product, and you would do that with every product in your restaurant, including all of your prepared items. So let's say that in addition to that 3 cases of canned tomatoes that we started out with, we also had 1 full batch of prepared marinara sauce. So for that, we would have had to have costed out our recipe. So in other words, taken the cost of the tomatoes, the onions, the celery, the wine, the herbs that go into this, leaving aside the labor, because that's a separate issue, just the cost of the food that goes into that. And we figure out how much 1 batch costs us. And so when we do our inventory, again, we would count our 3 cases of tomatoes and our 1 full batch of marinara. And so let's say at the end of that, just like we talked about, we had 3 cases, we bought 2, so we had 5 available, we wound up with 1, but now on our shelf we have 2 full batches of marinara. We may not have used all 4 cases of those tomatoes, depending on how many cans or how much of a case goes into a full batch of marinara, right? So that's where it gets maybe a little bit more complicated. Taking inventory in a large place can be very daunting, and the temptation is to not do it. And if you're in a situation where you're in a mature restaurant that's had 20 plus years of history, like my friend's place, then maybe you can get away with doing that. But when you're starting out and when you're trying to measure and control your products, taking a regular inventory is going to be very helpful. Now, you may not want to take inventory on everything. What you might want to do is identify the most expensive items and keep a watch on those. So, things like your steaks, your seafood, protein items, or expensive cheeses, or things like that, and really take a look at those. Okay. There are some intricacies of taking inventory that we'll get into in the food and beverage cost control class that's a little beyond the scope of this particular class. This is just about kind of setting things up. And that brings me to systems. So once you've got things measured, what you need in place are systems so that you can control your associated costs. So thinking about our example with the cases of tomatoes and the batches of marinara, it seems like we might not want to have on hand 2 full batches of marinara. Even having 1 full batch on hand might be too much. So we have to take a look at our production schedule. Are we making too much? And if we are, why? Do we have a system in place that lets us know what we need? So this introduces the concept of PARs, and by PAR I mean how much you are supposed to have on hand at any given time to make it through a period until you can next receive an order. So let's say that we've established a PAR of 1/2 batch of marinara on hand, meaning that once we get below a half batch of marinara, we need to make a new one. So that obviously puts us over par for a period, because if we start out with just under a half a batch, we make a full batch, we're going to have 1.5 batches on hand. But we keep our eye on that. We don't make another one until we again have only less than half a batch on hand. We might adjust our PARs to find that we only need to have 1/4 of a batch on hand, or maybe in a busy period the PAR gets adjusted upwards that we need 1.5 batches, or we may need 2 batches on hand at any period. In terms of what we have on our shelf, that's partly determined by the product itself and the delivery schedule. So for instance, using cases of canned tomatoes, those last for a considerably long time, so we can go for plenty of time between getting deliveries. So, we might come across a situation where our supplier has a great deal on canned tomatoes, and if we buy them now, we can lock in a very low price. So maybe we give many, many cans on the shelf at one time, many above what our PAR might be. But since they'll last, that kind of maybe doesn't matter because we've gotten such a good deal on it. On the other hand, fresh tomatoes are not going to last. So even if there's an incredibly great deal on fresh tomatoes, we're not going to stock up in that same way. Taking into account our delivery schedule also lets us know how much we can order at any given time. So here in Mendocino County, very often we get delivery on things like produce and fish twice a week, which means that we've got to make it through until our next order period. So if our orders come in, let's say on Friday, and don't come in again until Tuesday, we have to have enough on the shelf to handle Friday night, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and maybe enough to handle Tuesday as well, just in case the order doesn't come in on time or something gets shorted. So that's 4 to 5 days of product that we need to keep on our shelf. Now, there's no hard and fast rule for how much of anything we keep, because that's going to vary from establishment to establishment and what people are purchasing. So, obviously a place that features fried chicken is going to keep a lot more chicken on hand than a seafood restaurant, right? That's just common sense. So then we also need to measure what is selling. And that's called a menu mix. So that information we can get from our point of sale system. That should give us a breakdown of everything that gets sold. So, again, in a fried chicken place, maybe 70% of the sales are fried chicken dinners. 20% we also do fish and chips, so there's another 20%, and then 10% are some kind of miscellaneous items that we have, just because we know that there's always going to be somebody coming into the place that doesn't want fried chicken. So there's maybe a vegetarian option. We got some fried tofu, let's say, and that's our other 10%. So that'll give us an idea of how much product we need to make it from one period to the next. Now, in a small place, we can do this kind of intuitively, and just sort of guesstimate or know how much. But I can tell you it's a lot easier and a lot more profitable to actually keep track of these things and to put the effort in to do the inventory, track your sales, do your labor schedule accordingly, and keep an eye on those prime costs. So there are some resources in the module section that we can take a look at. I encourage you to play around with the sheets, fool around with those, and have a good time with them.